Hey guys, what's up? We're currently on the 67th floor here in the middle of Toronto, and this weekend I have the privilege of testing out the Sony A1 because I sneakily snuck it out of my brother's office. Today we're going to be talking about Sony's new flagship camera, the Sony A1. I was fortunate to snatch it from my brother for the weekend to do some real life situation tests with the Sony A1. In today's video, instead of going through all the camera specs of the Sony A1, I thought that I'd leave that to guys like Gerald Undone, and instead I would be talking about the camera user experience. I want to cover things like what was it like shooting with the Sony A1, and what was it like transitioning from Canon to Sony for the first time in my life. So let the camera nerd talk commence. So adjusting from Canon to Sony. I personally have actually never ever shot with a Sony camera on myself, and we all know the struggles of going from one camera system to another. You get so used to camera's buttons and menus and features and how to shoot with that camera that naturally it's always really hard to adjust to a new camera system. So like I said, when I went out and shot with the Sony A1, it was literally the first time ever that I've gone out and shot with a Sony camera on my own. Now right away when I started shooting with the Sony A1, the first thing that I realized that was really hard to get used to was the fact that if you want to switch lenses, you gotta press a button that's crammed here in the middle of all this. Whereas compared with Canon, the lens release button is right here. I think this is much better because your left hand is free to press it, and with your right hand you can take the lens. And with the Sony cameras, I find it really hard. I guess the whole point is to use your right hand, your finger, and take the lens off the left hand. But I'm much more confident with my right hand, so I definitely had a lot of struggles when it came to just changing lenses. I kept, by natural muscle memory, pressing here when I should be pressing here on the Sony cameras. The second thing that I struggled with was just navigating through Sony cameras menus. Maybe I'm just biased because I'm used to using Canon for such a long time, but in my opinion, it felt like the Canon menus and features were much easier to navigate than the Sony cameras. But again, I might be biased because I'm just really used to Canon cameras and I've never used Sony cameras before. But man, was I fumbling with the camera. I was having such a hard time trying to figure out different settings and where to find these things. But eventually, with a little bit of struggle, I was able to figure out and get the camera to settings that I liked. And lastly, I struggled with the LCD screen of the Sony A1. I feel like when you're shooting photos and video on the Sony cameras, the photos and video don't look as good on the LCD screen, but then when you bring it onto the computer, they look great. Whereas with Canon cameras, I feel a lot of times when you're shooting photo or video, it looks awesome on the LCD screen, but then when you bring it on the computer, you're often a little bit disappointed, to be honest. So I don't know which one's better, to get that stoke while you're shooting that it looks good on your camera, or to get that stoke when you're editing it on your computer. Maybe it is the latter, but for some reason I really like the LCD screen of the Canon cameras. But these are some of the issues that I struggled with going from Canon to Sony. But after a little bit of fumbling, a little bit of working through things, I was able to get the Sony A1 to have the right button settings, right settings for autofocus and everything that I wanted while shooting photo and video. And in the end, the shooting experience was actually surprisingly pleasant. And I also like the fact that when I did put the photos and video onto the computer, the stoke level was just so much higher because it looked so good on the computer. Alright, so the pros and the cons of the Sony A1. On the photo side, you have super fast, reliable autofocus. The camera shoots at 50 megapixels, and it shoots so dang fast that when I had it on the silent mode on high speed, I was pressing the shutter button, I wasn't sure is it taking photos, and all of a sudden when I went to check in the camera what kind of photos had I taken, I had literally taken probably 100 photos. So for the photo side, this camera is a beast. Especially if you're a wildlife photographer or a sports photographer, you need to get a lot of stills shot quickly, the Sony A1 would definitely be for you. For the video side, you have 8K up to 30 frames per second, you have 4K at 120 frames per second, you have 1080 at 240 frames per second, which is really fun. I don't know if you guys saw the video that we did on Matti's channel where we filmed with the Sony A1 at our cottage, and we were filming some epic shots at 240 frames per second of Matti cutting through the ice with a chainsaw. Anything with movement just looks so dang good at 240 frames per second. On top of all this, we got great dynamic range, we got fast, reliable autofocus, And they've added the new S-Cinetone picture profile, which is found in their higher end cinema cameras that they've now packed with this small little Sony A1 body. As well, there's no more recording limits, which is super handy, especially if you're a wedding videographer and you're documenting an event. You don't want the camera to turn off and stop recording during a ceremony or a speech, so now you don't have that problem. As well, if you're a high-end cinema filmmaker and you need that really high-end video footage quality, the Sony A1 shoots raw 16-bit 4K up to 60 frames per second, which is just unbelievable. Back in the day, you would have had to buy huge cinema cameras in order to get those kinds of specs, and now they're built into this small little body like the Sony A1. So those are the specs, but how did I actually enjoy using the camera in a real life situation? While I was shooting downtown with my wife Vera, shooting photos and video, I really liked what I saw. Just the reliability, the autofocus, how fast it was for shooting photos. The photos looked really, really crisp. On top of that, the video, I love 4K 120 frames per second, and being able to just, 100% rely on the autofocus, knowing that it's gonna be locked in at 4K 120 frames per second and just looks so buttery smooth. I really enjoyed that. So overall, the photo and the videos coming out of the Sony A1 were really, really epic and good looking. In the end, even though I've actually never shot with a Sony camera before, switching from Canon to Sony was actually really easy to do, and the whole shooting experience, just going around and taking photos and taking video, was actually very easy and very enjoyable with the Sony A1. For the Sony A1, literally the only con that I had was the LCD screen. On the Sony A1, they don't have the flip LCD screen, which makes it really hard to vlog. For example, when you're vlogging, there's no way to see how you're composing the shot. You can't really see what the exposure is on your face. I mean, you can do the old trick where you put your hand out and you expose your hand, but you never know while you're shooting, maybe the sun changes and your whole shot could be ruined. So for vlogging, it was really frustrating not having an LCD screen. And then on the photo side, there's so many times where I like to shoot really low to the ground or high up, and you just want to be able to see what you're shooting. You want to be able to see what the exposure is, what the composition is, and with the Sony A1 LCD screen, you can just tilt it a little bit, and it's fine for certain shots, but there are so many moments where I was like, why, Sony? Why? Why did you have to ruin this flagship camera by putting that LCD screen? Why can't we just have a flip LCD screen? Maybe in the future you guys could release two versions, one with the flip LCD screen and one with the tiltable. That might be a solution to keep everyone happy. So literally, the LCD screen was probably the only thing that I would complain about the Sony A1 and would say is a huge con, and maybe the price point. The camera does cost $6,500 US currently at B&H, which is practically the price of my Kia Rio car right now. So do you buy a car or do you buy the Sony A1? Tough call. It's crazy to think how expensive cameras can be, but at the same time, what they've packed into that camera would have back in the day probably cost $30,000, $40,000. So in some ways, cameras have got a lot more affordable. So who would I suggest the Sony A1 for? Well, I definitely would not suggest this camera for a beginner. You definitely don't need to dish out $6,500 for a camera because you just don't need those specs yet. But I would highly suggest this camera for wedding photographers and wedding videographers. I think the Sony A1 would be the perfect hybrid camera. This camera is tilting right now. It would be the perfect, oh, the legs are dropping. You never can trust a Gorilla Pod. But the Sony A1 would be perfect for wedding photographers and videographers like myself. I need a camera that I can shoot photos with and video with all in one camera body. And just all the new features in the Sony A1 would be perfect for shooting wedding videos. You could do 8K at 24 frames per second, then you could get that nice slow motion at 120 frames per second, and no recording limits, which would mean you don't have to worry about anything on a wedding day. So the Sony A1 would be perfect for wedding photographers, wedding videographers, as well for travel photographers and filmmakers. I know for myself, back in the day when I was traveling a lot, I always had the GH5 for video, and then I had a Canon camera body for photos. And I hated having to switch back and forth between two cameras. So now, the fact that in the Sony A1, you can shoot photos, you can shoot your video, all in one go, high quality on both sides, and both sides serving you very well. So I would say that if you're a travel photographer and filmmaker, the Sony A1 would be perfect. Lastly, I would suggest this camera for sports photographers, wildlife photographers who need that fast shutter and reliable autofocus to get a nice, crisp photo. I would definitely suggest this camera for you guys. Would I suggest the Sony A1 for YouTube content creators? Probably not, because I think that an LCD screen is so important when you're vlogging, and you don't necessarily need 8K or all these crazy specs when you're creating vlogs. You more so need that really high quality footage when you're making more high-end productions, so I would not suggest the Sony A1 for vloggers. Unless it was like a B camera that you just use to film epic, slow motion, high quality 8K footage, then that would maybe serve a purpose. But for vlogging, without that LCD screen, it's just not worth it. Alright guys, that's my thoughts on the Sony A1. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. A lot of you guys at this point are probably wondering, Teppo, have you switched from Canon to Sony? And I don't know yet. Maddie's definitely trying really hard to force me to jump on the Sony bandwagon, but let's see which camera serves my purposes best. Alright guys, my lunch break's about to end. It's time to go back to editing.